Hello and welcome to the 10th webinar in the Seabed Habitats Seminar series. Today we're very fortunate to have with us Professor Alex David Rogers, Science Director of REV and visiting professor at the Department of Zoology, University of Oxford. As this is the last webinar in 2021, here is a short summary of the seminar series so far. So these are some of the word cloud. This is a word cloud of the some of the diverse aspects of marine science related to seabed habitats, which has been covered in the series so far. So here, if this is your first webinar, please feel free to view previous seminars on YouTube or on the Seabed Habitats blog. So you can see that we've tried to get a balance between gender and experience levels of speakers. So we would like to introduce Professor Alex David Rogers, who's the Science Director of REV and visiting professor at the Department of Zoology. He's a marine ecologist who's interested in how biodiversity is distributed in the ocean, especially in the deep sea and on tropical coral reefs. He's also interested in the human impacts on the ocean and how to manage human activities to mitigate or reduce degradation of marine ecosystems. His work has taken him to the Atlantic, Indian and Southern Oceans and to the Caribbean, investigating coral reef ecosystems, seamounts and deep sea hydrothermal vents. Alex has worked with governments, intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations in publicizing human impacts, especially those from the deep sea fishing and climate change, and on development of policy solutions to such problems. He's Scientific Director of REV Ocean, a foundation working towards a healthy ocean. Alex recently published a book, The Deep, The Hidden Wonders of Our Ocean and How We Can Protect Them. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to
Alex. You can see my first slide, is that correct? Thank you, Sidi. So I'm going to talk to you today about some of the deep sea habitats that I've explored over the last, I guess, 10 to 15 years. And I thought I'd just start by saying that, we haven't actually been exploring the deep ocean for that long. It's about 150 years or so. And many people point to the voyage of HMS Challenger as being the beginning of modern deep sea ocean science. However, around this time, there were many other voyages taking place with vessels from various parts of Europe, the US, involved in taking our first steps into exploring the deep sea. And of course, since then, we've undertaken sufficient research to really realize that the ocean is incredibly important in terms of the Earth system and also to us as humankind. So you can see some figures here published by WWF in 2015 of the ocean representing gross marine product of $2.5 trillion per annum with an asset value of 24 trillion. And of course, the ocean supports a whole range of ecosystem services in all the 4 major classes of provisioning, regulatory, supporting, and cultural. And these range from very obvious things such as food provision and carbon dioxide sequestration to less obvious things such as absorbing waste and regulating climate and the atmosphere. And of course, cultural services such as inspiration, education, and science. Although these are very, very rough figures, states have started to look at their own natural capital, including in the ocean. And this is an example from just this year from the UK, which published its own marine accounts. And you'll see here a rather startling figure of natural capital assets in the seas around Britain of about £211 billion, and CO2 sequestration of somewhere between 10 to 60 million tonnes per annum. You can see there's quite a lot of uncertainty around that figure. Now, what was very surprising to me about this study was, despite the UK probably having some of the best explored waters in the world, data were incomplete for many aspects of natural capital accounting in the ocean, and more than a third of UK marine habitats were classified as simply unknown. And no doubt much of that is in the deep sea. So, as many of you will know, as we move away from land and into deeper water, our level of knowledge about the deep ocean, about the ocean declines. This is an example of a paper from Webb in 2010, where they simply looked at the number of records in the Ocean Biodiversity Information System. And the cold colours here are less species, the warm more. And as you can see, essentially our knowledge declines with depth and distance from the continental shelf. And indeed, the least explored and known habitat in the ocean is the deep pelagic. In 2011, Mora published this paper, which I think is probably still one of the best estimates of the species diversity in the ocean. He came up with a figure of about 2.2 million species, of which we described somewhere between 180 and 200,000 species. So apparently we've only described about 10% of the diversity in the ocean. And if we take that up to the level of habitats, we find an equally fairly surprising picture in terms of the amounts of various deep water habitats we've actually explored using modern deep water submergence methods. So you can see here, deep water pelagic, less than 0.0001%, the deep sea floor about 0.001%, 0.0001%, and seamount still less than 0.002%. In fact, the best explored ecosystems in the deep ocean are hydrothermal vents and other chemosynthetic ecosystems. And we know of the position of, it's estimated, about a third of those features in the ocean. This is based on a report I led for the European Marine Board in 2015. So in the, mainly in the North Atlantic, Indian Ocean, and in the Southern Ocean. And today I'm going to just talk about some of the work we did in the Southern Ocean, looking at these habitats, deep sea, high temperature hydrothermal vents. And you can see the plumes of vent fluid. Extinct seabed here had a temperature of about 386 degrees C, I think it was. So what are these ecosystems? Well, essentially, they're located in places where magma is relatively close to the sea floor, so lying beneath the surface, and where seawater penetrates that surface rock and comes into close contact with those magma chambers or the hot rocks around them. You get a complex exchange of chemicals between the seawater and those rocks, and end up with vent end member fluid. This obviously becomes hot and therefore buoyant and rushes up to the seafloor, where it exits through these high temperature black smokers. If that vent end member fluid is diluted with fresh seawater before exiting the seafloor, obviously you get different types of flows, such as white smokers or even diffuse flows exiting the seafloor across a wider area. And it was only in 1977 when these habitats were first described from Alvin dives in the Galapagos Rift, where these fantastic accumulations of marine life were found, quite unlike anything seen in the deep sea previously. And of course, this discovery actually had some quite major ramifications in terms of our understanding of the envelope at which life can exist, not only on Earth, but also potentially elsewhere in our galaxy and indeed in the universe. And furthermore, it was found after several years of research, particularly related to the Lost City hydrothermal vent, that these vents may host conditions which were quite similar to those when life evolved on Earth about 4 billion years ago. And this gives rise to the possibility that vents elsewhere in the solar system may have given rise to a second genesis of life. So there's a lot of excitement now around the science of astrobiology and looking for evidence of life elsewhere, not only in the wider universe, but closer to home. Now, this is roughly the picture of where vents have been located back in the early 2000s. And what we knew about the vents at that point was that the types of life you find around vents varies depending on which part of the ocean you're in. So the areas where vents were first discovered in the Northeast Pacific were typically dominated by tube worms, including the giant Riftia pachytilla, which you saw in the previous slide, vent mussels, various types of alvanellid tube worms, and other species. Over in the Northwest Pacific, we saw more of a dominance by snails, barnacles, and other species. In the Atlantic Ocean, vents visually were quite dominated by these huge swarms of shrimps, in particular Rhinicaris exoculata, and also vent mussels. And the Indian Ocean was very interesting because that seemed to host communities of organisms which seemed to have an origin both from the Pacific but also the Atlantic. So we saw vent mussels that were typical of the Pacific and also vent barnacles, but these swarms of shrimp very closely related to the species found in the Atlantic. But as well as that, there was a local flavor in terms of animals like the scalyfoot snail. You see here the only animal to secrete iron armor, which a PhD student of mine, Chong Chen, and I described back in, I think it was 2015, although it was discovered initially by another group of scientists. So the question arose as to how organisms were moving between these vent systems over geological time. And the obvious answer to that was the Southern Ocean, because that was the body of water which really connected all three of these ocean systems. So we put in a proposal to NERC as part of the Census of Marine Life program, and were awarded funding to go and investigate the East Scotia Ridge. I'll show you where that is in a moment, down in the Southern Ocean for vents. And the reason for that was that there had been evidence of vent plumes over the ridge found by Chris German, scientists from Hui, prior to that proposal going in. As you can see from the photograph here, working in this part of the world is not that easy. This particular storm, we had waves with a height of about 15 meters, or swells with a height of about 15 meters. So probably the biggest storm that I've ever experienced on a vessel. But luckily, it was the only large storm we actually experienced during several cruises in this region. So the East Scotia Ridge is shown on the slide here. You can see it just to the west of the South Sandwich Islands. The ridge has 9 segments, and we located the hydrothermal vents on the first cruise, essentially using a combination of tow yowing with CTDs, with a water sampling rosette and towed camera system. And we found 2 areas of hydrothermal venting, both located at swellings in the ridge, one on the 2nd segment and one on the 9th. The first one we nicknamed the Mermaid's Purse because of the shape, and the second one the Devil's Punch Bowl because of this enormous collapse crater in the ridge just to the south of where we located the vents. And we came back with a remotely operated vehicle to actually document the biological communities from these vents, which we got the first hints of from the towed cameras. And what we actually found was really quite amazing. You can see here some of the film from diffuse venting around the E9 hydrothermal vents. And you can see these enormous aggregations of yeti crabs around the vents here. This was a new species, keyword Tyleri, and you can see they occur in really vast numbers around these vents. Though, of course, these are very localized sites, just tens of meters really in diameter. These animals have very hairy chests, hence being nicknamed the Hoff crab by one of my PhD students or postdocs at the time, Nick Roterman. And of course, that name gained popularity through a BBC news item and went viral around the world. And these crabs essentially make their living by combing bacteria off their hairs and feeding on them. And you can see them here jostling for the best position around this diffuse flow. And of course, the bacteria are chemosynthetic, and like other hydrothermal vents, oxidation of hydrogen sulfide and other reduced chemicals in the vent fluids is the basis of the food chain around these vents. Not only did we find many of these crabs, but also huge numbers of these very large gastropod snails. This was a new genus and a new species. And you can see the little green blebs all over the snails here, and indeed on the crabs. This was a new species of limpet, quite closely related to the Atlantic Lepetodrilus. So this was quite exciting. It suggested that maybe our hypothesis was correct. And also these barnacles, a species of Volcanolepus, which also turned out to be a new species. And indeed, of the 24 or so megafauna that we sampled from these vents, all of them were new to science, some at the level of family, some at the level of genus, and some just at species level. What was really striking, though, about these vents was what was not there. So we found no evidence of hydrothermal vent shrimps, no evidence of tube worms, no evidence of vent mussels, no alphanella polychaetes, no bathygraeid crabs, and many other groups which we were hoping to find as evidence of this trans-Southern Ocean migration over geological timescales of organisms from the Pacific to Indian Ocean or Atlantic to Indian Ocean, for example. So what that cruise actually suggested was that the very cold waters of the Southern Ocean actually act as a selective filter to hydrothermal vent fauna. And essentially, we do know that animals with certain types of life history, such as those with planktotrophic larvae, have a lower level of occurrence than those with lithotrophic larvae in the Southern Ocean. So this could be connected with life history. It could also be connected with the physiology of animals as well. As a result of this work, we revised the biogeography of hydrothermal vents, estimating that there were 11 distinct biogeographic provinces globally, and this model still stands today in terms of our understanding of the distribution of different communities on vents around the world. The next habitat I'd like to talk about are seamounts, and these really are an ecosystem or a habitat which has fascinated me since early postdoc times at the Marine Biological Association in Plymouth. And I noticed Paul Dando on the list of the audience here from my days when I was at Plymouth. So this is the Anton Dawn seamount. It's one of the UK's seamounts, really quite a spectacular looking structure. And I had the pleasure of actually observing this seamount for real in 2016 on a cruise led by Kerry Howell at the University of Plymouth. But just to say that these habitats are really very, very common in the ocean. This is some work that I did with Chris Yessen, published in 2011, estimating where seamounts were located globally. And in this case, this illustrates large seamounts, so those with an elevation of more than 1,000 meters. And you can see there are well over 33,000 of these features in the ocean, covering something like 4.7% of the global seafloor. So really a very significant habitat in terms of its aerial coverage. Now, seamounts are incredibly important because they are real hotspots of biodiversity, not only in terms of the organisms living on the seamounts themselves, but also in terms of their importance to large ocean megafauna such as whales, sharks, tunas, billfish, other large predatory fish, squid and octopuses, seals, turtles, and seabirds. And these organisms use seamounts as foraging places, but also sometimes as navigational waypoints and even as places to breed or spawn. There are also significant stocks of demersal fish, deep sea demersal fish, located around these seamounts. And the reason they're there is because we think that seamounts act to trap the diurnally migrating layers of nekton and zooplankton that move between the mesopelagic zone and surface of the ocean every day. And these get affected over the seamounts at night time, where they're fed upon by some of these resident and semi-resident predators. So this is one example, the orange ruffy. It lives for an extremely long time, up to 150 years. They don't mature until they're 30 or 40 years old. They aggregate to spawn around seamounts, which unfortunately makes them easy to target using trawling. And they're located globally in temperate waters. And they occur right from the Atlantic, North Atlantic, down through the Indian Ocean, where this one was photographed on one of our expeditions to the Southwest Indian Ridge, through to the South Pacific. Now, as I said, these seamounts also host very rich communities of benthic organisms. This is actually a cold water coral reef located on the Anton Dorn seamount at a depth of about 400 meters, made up of the species known as Lophelia purpusa or Desmophyllum purpusum more recently. And you can see this extraordinary framework of Lophelia with all sorts of other organisms living on and amongst those coral branches. And you'll see another typical feature of these reefs here, in that much of the framework is actually dead, with this kind of rind of living corals occurring over the dead framework. But of course, these aren't the only vulnerable marine ecosystems located on seamounts. You also have dense coral gardens. This is one photographed on one of the seamounts on the southwest Indian Ridge. I forget which one it actually was now, which is a bit annoying. But you can see this rich coral garden formed of a variety of oct corals, but also a myriad of other organisms, stylasterids, bryozoans, sponges, and all sorts of other things living in amongst them and covering the rock surfaces almost entirely on this seamount, which is Melville Bank. Sorry, it took me a little while to drag that out of my brain. And of course, there are really spectacular communities formed by other organisms, such as these large megafaunal sponges. This one, again, photographed in the Northeast Atlantic on Kerry's 2016 cruise. One of the features of seamounts, which we find very difficult to communicate both to the public, but also to industry who are interested in exploiting these ecosystems, either for fishing or for marine minerals, is the really dramatic levels of heterogeneity associated with habitats on seamounts. Depth, substratum, topographic features at scales from kilometers to meters, the aspect of the seamount, its history, the surrounding water masses, all lead to a very varied range of biological habitats and communities on these ecosystems. So you can see here, this is just a sand-covered summit of Atlantis Bank, in this case, on the Southwest Indian Ridge. But elsewhere on the ridge, you see these types of habitats. In this case, a mixture of basalt bedrock and boulders, hosting these really quite striking octocoral communities. I think that's a new species of corallium in the foreground there. And, you know, very mixed habitats with mixtures of rock and sediment, and moving to much smaller scales. And this is just an example from Atlantis Bank, where on that sandy summit, you saw a couple of slides back, there were these granitic intrusions, which formed these small hillocks on the summit of the seamount, which of course formed habitat for corals. But one of the really lovely micro habitats we found associated with this were these piles of sediment made up of urchin spines, and specifically of the spines of this sea urchin, Dermachinus horridus, obviously named because of the very horrid nature of the spines when you come to try and pick the animals up. But you can see that this habitat formed by urchin spines here is occupied by, in this case, these tube anemones, cereanthids, and we only saw these cereanthids in these tiny pockets of sea urchin spine habitats. I mean, they may well occur elsewhere, but it just gives you an idea of the small scales over which habitat heterogeneity can operate on these seamount ecosystems. So of course, as I started to learn more about seamounts, I also, me and a number of other scientists realized that they were being targeted by deep sea fisheries for animals like orange roughy. Not only was this a significant sustainability issue because the orange roughy and a number of other deep sea seamount species turned out to have a very low resilience and high vulnerability to fishing, meaning that we saw serial depletion of their stocks around the world. But because these animals actually tend to dive for the seabed when they're threatened, they were fished using bottom trawls. And this was the pair of photographs shown by Jeremy Coslow back at a seminar in Southampton in, I think it was the early 1990s, that really woke me up to the damage done by this deep sea trawling to deep sea ecosystems. So here you see a photograph from two seamounts located to the south of Tasmania. The one on the left shows a seamount that hasn't been trawled, and you can see this wonderful cold water coral reef habitat formed mainly by the species Solanus variabilis, and then a seamount in the same area which has been fished, and you can see it's as though a bomb has gone off on the seafloor. The entire habitat forming framework of the corals has been obliterated by those trawling activities. So this was a major problem, and many scientists, including not just me, but some others who've spoken on this series, have worked specifically on this topic. But at the end of the 2010s, we wanted to try and figure out where these habitats were occurring on seamounts globally using modelling. And the only way to convince the fishing industry and others that modelling might be useful in showing us where these habitats occurred was to do that modelling and then go out somewhere which had not been previously visited to see whether these ecosystems were present. And this is indeed what we did with RRS James Cook. And I'm happy to say we did find cold water coral habitat exactly where we predicted it would occur. So this is a lovely cold water coral reef located in the southern Indian Ocean, in this case on Coral Bank Seamount on the southwest Indian Ridge at about, I think it was about 40 degrees south. And you can see this framework, again, mainly made up of dead coral, but there are also live coral as well. And again, you know, inhabited by a very wide range of other species. You can see here octocorals, sponges, and I can tell you in all of the cracks and crevices, there were squat lobsters and other mobile organisms living as well. These weren't the only habitats and communities we saw. This is the summit of Melville Bank, where you can actually see a mesophotic community on the seafloor here. We even picked up in some of these areas coral reef fish occurring much further south than anyone realized. And of course, these communities of large demersal fish, you can see a wreckfish here, and as you, and even in deeper water, so the summit of Melville Bank is 100 or so meters. This is down at about 1,000 meters plus. And you can see here a blunt-nosed six-gilled shark wandering around looking for things to eat, obviously, and attracted, as these animals often are, to the lights and probably the electric field of the REV. Now, of course, not all seamounts host just rocky or coral habitats or sponge habitats. Some of them are sufficiently shallow to actually host algal habitats as well. And this is an example from just south of Bermuda. This is Plantagenet Bank, and you can see us in a submersible here. We're at a depth of, I think, about 100 meters in this case. And you can see this, really dense bed of algae across this seamount. And it was really interesting to see the amount of algal material being blown off this seamount by strong currents and being washed into the deep ocean, where no doubt it's a source of food. So this is a mesophotic community of animals. You can see various coral reef fish associated with this seamount summit. And that's just a close-up of the same algae. And indeed, around these mesophotic depths on both the seamounts and around Bermuda itself, we found a staggering range of undescribed species. So despite Bermuda hosting marine biology lab for, I think, since the 1930s, essentially, once you got below scuba diving depth in these islands, there was lots of new biodiversity to discover. And in particular, the mesophotic algae communities were extremely rich in undescribed species. And the nearest relatives to some of these were over in Australia, which is quite amazing. And it might sound like a kind of strange biogeographic pattern of occurrence, but what it suggests to me is that these types of communities probably occur globally. They just really haven't been observed and described in many parts of the world. This was another new type of community we found around Bermuda. These were coral gardens or coral beds made of oct corals and black corals. You can see these really lovely corals here, all leaning parallel to the current flow. And the sea floor here is made up mainly of rhodoliths, some of which are tumbling, in fact, most of which is tumbling down from shallower waters above. This is at about 300 meters or so. And indeed, one of the things that we found in Bermuda was not only a mesophotic community, and these were well known from the deeper reaches of coral reefs, but also a rarophotic community of fish and indeed benthic fauna as well. The rarophotic zone is the zone between 150 to 300 meters. It was first described in 2018 by scientists from the Smithsonian Institution from Curacao, and we found it in Bermuda as well. And essentially, the fish communities in this zone are typically from shallow water families, but they're made up of distinct species inhabiting this deep water zone, indeed bordering on the deep ocean. Now, our work on seamounts has also demonstrated human impacts, and this again is from the Southwest Indian Ridge, where we discovered it wasn't only fishing for orange ruffy that was going on, people were also fishing for spiny lobsters. And this was remarkable because you're talking about some of the most remote seamounts in the world here, lying between Madagascar and Africa and the Antarctic. And yet there was an unregulated fishery going on here for these spiny lobsters. And of course, a lot of fishing gear was being lost, and that was ghost fishing. So of course, this lobster was in the process of dying. And once that's dead and starts to decay, it will attract other scavengers and they get caught in the nets as well. This was another example, this again from Melville Bank, where we found 2 toes of lobster pots completely tangled up with each other, strewn all over a cliff face on the seamount. So really quite amazing and quite depressing to see these types of impacts way out in the open ocean. And not just in terms of fishing gear, but also detritus thrown overboard from fishing vessels, including rubber gloves and bits of engine fittings and so on. And indeed, when we came to look at the sediments on these seamounts down to depths of about 1,500 meters, we found lots of microplastic particles, and Lucy Woodall published a series of papers on these microplastics in the deep ocean from this particular cruise. So I thought I'd just finish this talk by discussing deep sea mining just for a few slides. And I thought I'd just start really by pointing out that deep sea mining, of course, involves a number of different potential deposits. So we have everything from manganese nodules located on abyssal plains, seabed massive sulfides found on mid-ocean ridges and Blackheart basins, and cobalt crust found on seamounts and marine phosphates found in productive areas of the ocean on seamounts or on the continental slope. And these are the areas that we know about in terms of the three main mineral deposits of interest at the moment. So you can see here areas of polymetallic nodules, cobalt-rich ferromanganese crust, mainly on seamounts, and polymetallic sulfides located on ridges. And of course, you also see noted here the countries out in areas beyond national jurisdiction, which have exploration licenses from the International Seabed Authority to look for mineral resources in these areas. Now, this, of course, is a very controversial activity. And one of the really controversial aspects of it is our lack of knowledge of deep ocean habitats and communities which are faced with this potential mining activity. And a lot of attention is honed in on the Clarion-Clipperton fracture zone, where there is a stated intention to mine polymetallic nodules from the seafloor at depths between 4,000 to 6,000 meters. Now, fortunately, there's been a real flurry of work around this area over the last 10 years. So I'll just pull out a few examples of this work. This is one study which was just published last year, looking at the biodiversity of communities across this Clarion-Clipperton fracture zone in these conservation or preservation areas. And these scientists actually used molecular barcoding or environmental DNA to look at the diversity of species across this zone. And what you see here very obviously is that the communities are very, very different, moving from east to west across the CCFZ, but also they differ really quite markedly between communities sampled on the actual abyssal plain versus the seamounts in this region. So this is giving our first clues that as opposed to many claims that this area of the deep sea was essentially very homogeneous, had a relatively low diversity, and showed very little difference from place to place. The picture that's now rising is that we have an area associated with considerable biodiversity and where we see considerable heterogeneity across the region. And in terms of the wider impacts of this seafloor mining, one of the things that has also been of interest is looking at the potential range of dispersal of the sediment plumes from the mining operation and from release of sediment from the barges used to process the nodules once they've been brought to the surface. And this is an example of a study just published this year where they used a combination of modeling with ground truthing using actual release of sediment at the ocean surface. And I'm not going to say too much about this because I'm not a physical oceanographic modeler, but the take home of this paper was that a single mining operation over the space of a year could release settlement that settled over more than 1,000 kilometers of the seabed in various directions from the mining operation. So quite a remarkable finding there. And the final study I'd like to mention is this one by Stratman et al., published this year, where again, a combination of actual observations and literature research were used to identify the trophic and non-trophic interactions in the Clarion-Clipperton fracture zone and the Peru Basin. And these scientists modeled the effects of removing nodules through mining in this zone, and they estimated that the knockdown of these trophic and non-trophic interactions was in the region of 17.9 to 20.8%, depending on whether you're looking at the CCFZ or Peru Basin, in terms of loss of taxa, sorry, not loss of trophic links. And for the loss of network links, it was between 22.8 and 30.6%. So really quite significant impacts here on not just biodiversity, but also ecosystem function. And the taxa which really appeared to be important here were the stalk sponges, which of course form habitat for many other species. So to summarize all that, and I'm hoping I've got a little bit of time for questions, much of the ocean still remains to be explored. There's a need for more knowledge for management. Hotspot ecosystems in the ocean can be extremely heterogeneous and can comprise high biodiversity, high endemism, and high biological activity. And there is a need for more basic knowledge, particularly on biodiversity, in order to manage human threats to the deep ocean. And indeed, I'm currently working on planning a new global biodiversity project, which we're hoping will be funded next year, and which I will hopefully be in a position to talk to you about in 12 months' time. So that's all I wanted to say. So thank you very much for attending and listening. And also thank you, City, for inviting me to come and talk to you today, and for organising the seminar. So with that, I would like to open the floor to questions, if you have any.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Alex Rogers, for the fascinating talk around the provinces in the deep sea. And if anybody has any questions, yeah, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask or put them in the chat. I had a question about deep sea mining, but how does it affect the biodiversity of seamounts?
Well, we know that the diversity is the biological communities associated with crust, certainly in the Northwest Pacific, are distinct from those elsewhere on the seamounts. So there would be a direct impact on those specific communities, but also a lot of other impacts on other areas of the seamount, both through disturbance and through release of sediment. And indeed on these other predators around the seamount. And I see a question here from Andrew Friedman, where he says, do you have any thoughts on deep ocean impacts through the water column? Yes, absolutely. Certainly in the case of seamounts, the noise and the light associated with those operations would certainly disturb some of the communities of megafauna around the seamounts, as well as the demersal species. I mean, even when we lower a CTD into the ocean around a seamount, we can see on our echo sounders fish rushing away from that CTD. So you can imagine what would happen if you're mining in this area. In terms of hydrothermal vent fields, there's been fascinating evidence in the North Pacific showing trophic links from hydrothermal vents all the way up to pelagic ecosystems in the euphotic zone. And this kind of link occurs through a stepwise fashion. So you have migrating zooplankton feeding on bacteria which are coming from the vent plumes, and they're fed upon by successively shallower layers of biota, and even potentially by humpback whales in shallower waters above those vents. And indeed, as I've already mentioned, the sediment plumes from these vents will potentially impact on the water column, depending on the depth at which those sediments are released. So lots of impacts, not only direct impacts on the sites of those mining activities, but also on the surrounding marine ecosystems as well. Yeah, shall I just move on to some of these other questions? Yeah, so Sarah Pierce, sorry, asked, has UNCLOS been updated recently? There have been a number of revisions to UNCLOS. There was the 1995 Fish Stocks Agreement, and then the agreement that led to the formation of the International Seabed Authority. But absolutely right now, we're in the throes of negotiating a new agreement to conserve biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So we're right in the middle of updating the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea with respect to biodiversity in the high seas and the area. And indeed, on plastics, also the aim is to sign an international treaty on plastics next year, or at least get that treaty formulated. So a lot of really exciting things happening in terms of managing human impacts on the ocean at the moment, but a very, very long way to go. We've got another question here from Emma Curtis about removing ghost fishing gear from seamounts. Well, as you can imagine, it's really difficult because first of all, you've got to get a ship out to these locations, and you're talking about very large and expensive ships. Then you've got to locate the gear, and then it can potentially be removed using grappling or hooks or other means of tangling the gear and lifting it from the sea floor. It's technically not an easy job to do that in a safe manner. And really the best thing to do is to just try and prevent the loss of that gear in the first place through better management of these fisheries. Yes, the rhodoliths. Well, these were a really fascinating story from Bermuda. They were certainly very important in habitat formation, in mesophotic, in fact, in shallow and mesophotic and rarophotic waters. We think we saw some of these still alive down at depths of 100 meters or more. So it wouldn't surprise me if those rhodoliths are still living, even at depths of several hundred meters. We simply haven't sampled them from these depths to understand just how deep these organisms can actually survive and still grow. Gosh, what kind of human intervention, underwater engineering can be beneficial to conservation efforts? Well, that covers a very wide range of human sins in the ocean. Certainly in terms of fisheries, we can modify fishing gear and fishing practices to have lower impacts. We can ban the most damaging types of activities from the deep ocean. I think in the case of deep sea mining, we're still in the phase of gathering knowledge. And so many scientists and policymakers are calling for a 10-year moratorium on on deep sea mining as a result of that. So I hope I've picked up all the questions there. Happy to answer any further, or you're welcome to contact me offline if you have any further questions. Yeah, Sarah Pierce, I presume you mean sunlight by solar beams. Yes, you can detect sunlight down to about 1,000 meters depth. So the lowest level of detection essentially is at the base of the mesopelagic zone. And although we can't see light at this intensity, many of the animals that live in the mesopelagic zone have very special adaptations in terms of their visual systems to actually see at very, very low light intensities. And also, they have really spectacular adaptations to life in low light in terms of their methods of hiding, because food is in very short supply at these depths, and everything is trying to avoid being eaten by everything else.
I just had one question actually.
Yeah.
What is, I've been reading your book, and you describe diving in submersible off the coast of Bermuda. What is it like to be in a submersible, and what are the technical challenges?
Oh gosh. Well, I personally love diving in submarines. The deepest I've been is about 3,800 meters in the Shinkai 6,500. That's a very different experience to diving in the Triton subs, because as you saw from the video, the sphere in the Tritons is completely clear acrylic. We're currently building a sub of that type to dive to depths of about 2,200 meters. And they give you a completely unrivaled view of the deep ocean and deep ocean habitats. So I could sit in one of those subs down at 300 meters off Bermuda and look up and see the shape of the entire seascape above me. I could see chutes where sediment was coming down from the shallow water down onto the slopes of the island and everything. So really, you know, it's a different way of seeing the ocean. It gives you a very good view of the overall seascape down at depth. And of course, these submarines are fantastic platforms for surveying and for sampling marine life as well. And they're very good on steep topography, where with an ROV, you often have issues with the tether, snagging on rock and so on. You don't have that problem with submersibles. So I'm a big fan of submarines. And if you ever get the chance, then do go down in one. And finally, we have a question here about sediment plumes affecting planktonic life. I think that certainly is a risk. I haven't seen any detailed work on that, but I'm sure it's going to emerge over the next couple of years. I mean, one of the things about that study about dispersal of sediment I spoke about during the talk was that they make the point that we don't know the actual concentrations at which this sediment affects marine life. So, so that is the next really important question with respect to these sediment plumes and effects on biological communities.
I think that covers all the questions. So we'd like to thank Professor Alex Rogers for such a fascinating inspiring talk about the range of habitats in the deep, and also the challenges and threats faced in the coming decade.
Yeah, my pleasure, Sidi, and many thanks for organising the seminar, and thanks to everyone who could attend today. I love talking about this stuff, as you probably figure out. So it's always a pleasure to talk about these things. Many thanks. Thanks, Denise, as well. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for everybody for joining, and hope to see you next year.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Sidi. I'll sign off now, and yeah, good luck with the seminar series in 2022.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Cheers. Bye.